Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we are honored to have on return guest, friend, colleague, Dr. Joseph Burkes or Joseph Burkes, MD. So welcome back, Joe.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back. And just for everybody watching this on YouTube or listening on the podcast, I did also want to announce, some of you might be aware of, we're hosting another event in New York City. And that's an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon. This time is going to be held on December 3rd, Saturday, December 3rd, in New York City. So stay tuned for Engage in the Phenomenon on Twitter for details on that. But it's great to have you back, Joe. And for people listening to this or watching this, we've done at least 3 or 4 talks before. And the links are going to be in the description so people can catch up on those discussions. But today we have a number of things to go over, and I wanted to start out with the idea of something, a term you coined called Prime Contactees. So for people watching and listening, can you explain what the term Prime Contactee means and how you came about it?
Well, it's easy to explain the concept. How it came to me would require a detailed explanation. But a prime contactee is a high-level contact experiencer with UFO intelligences. These individuals are primarily men that I've come across, although a female would be definitely called a prime contactee. And I can talk about someone who I'll speak of as Tracy Travis. That's not her real name. But we did field work in 1997. She had a remarkable CV when it came to her personal contact protocols. And yes.
And I would just say as a female prime contactee would definitely be Dorothy Izat or Dorothy Izat. Yeah,
that's right. But I didn't work with her, so
right. Just for people listening, if they have an idea, if you look at Dorothy Izat, that's a perfect example of a prime contactee.
So these individuals usually are approached in childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood. They have repeated sightings of what we call unidentified aerial phenomena, flying saucers, but also as time goes on, they develop psychic capabilities that allow for direct telepathic communication. And they have the unique characteristics that they can request a UFO sightings with others present, and sightings occur with multiple witnesses present to verify not only the event, but that special relationship with UFO intelligences. Christopher Bledsoe is perhaps a prime contactee, but he doesn't follow the usual pattern in as much as he was in his, I think, late 40s when he had a series of important encounters and turned him into a veritable UFO magnet. People use various terms, calling the UFOs down, but I like to think of it as requesting a sighting because that is more consistent with the power relationship between people and the intelligences behind the phenomena. They are the more active partner in the dance, if contact could be seen as a dance, and we are the more passive ones. And so prime contactees have a special interest for people like me back in the 90s because I was a working group coordinator for a CE5 initiative. I was a member of the board of directors for the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence from 1992 till I resigned in 1998. I was closely associated with the other working group coordinators. I'm the only surviving member. Wayne Peterson died. He was the working group coordinator for Phoenix, passed away about 6-7 years ago. And the most important working group coordinator, the one who did the most to develop the protocols with Stephen Greer, I'm talking about Sherry Adamek. She died in 1998. So I'm going to share with the audience the kind of contacts that I had and the way in which the non-human intelligence associated with the phenomena facilitated my involvement by connecting me with these prime contactees. And one of the things that I did when I was actively organizing working groups, not to any great success, but it certainly kept me busy from 1992 to 1997 when I was an emergency room physician. We had 2 school-age children at home, and was working a lot of hours, all-nighters, along with all-night vigils, going out into the field, primarily in Joshua Tree National Monument, but also other locations in Southern California. So I was pretty busy, and what I found was that, like in Hollywood, they say in Hollywood, it's not what you know, but who you know. In other words, if you want to get ahead as an actor, director, cinematographer, screenwriter, you got to have connections. And if you are connected to a prime contactee, a person who has an established track record of attracting the phenomena, then you hang out with them, you're going to see a lot of stuff. And the high level involvement that that individual has can be transferred to you so that you start having multiple sightings when other people are present. In other words, I saw it primarily not as a scientific investigation, but as an organizing type of tool to find the prime contactees. And I used to make the joke that once you join the contact underground and are involved with prime contactees, you'll never be lonely again, because this phenomena will follow you home and will stay with you in one form or another for the rest of your life.
Okay, so I was going to say, is the proximity to a prime contactee like a residual effect? And in kind of another way is, the term has a negative connotation nowadays because of how it's been used, but it almost sounds like a kind of positive version of the hitchhiker effect.
Well, yeah, I would say the hitchhiker effect is a negative version of how
Right.
contact is transferred. I would put it that way. Yeah, the counterintelligence people who got very upset when they got involved with this subject, they, in Skinwalker Ranch and others, we have to, point out, and this is something that Grant Cameron has said, these are people who are, they're soldiers. They think in terms of conflict and fighting. And if you, the phenomena to a great extent, and John Keel has written about this, is a kind of, what it is, it mirrors or reflects your stage of consciousness. If you have a particular theory about the subject, the consciousness behind the phenomena, the so-called aliens, will stage, often in a kind of trickster way, contact events that reinforce your pre-existing belief structure. So if you're involved with conflict, fighting, killing, and you approach as a counterintelligence officer, UFO intelligences or other non-human intelligences as a potential enemy, they will reflect back on you. So it's a kind of reflective phenomena. Not reflective in the terms of deep thought, but more reflective in the terms of like a mirror reflecting back an image.
All right.
So I wanted to make that point because, people are becoming more aware, the general public, of this phenomena. And my background is in peace and social justice movements in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so, I always saw this issue in the context of the potential of creating a social movement that would link contact with non-human intelligences to the possibility of creating a social movement that will link that phenomena to conceivable solutions for these fundamental crises. And I'm talking about war, talking about hatred, which is racism, but also ethnic rivalries and religious hatreds or manifestations. And also, of course, you've got the obscene disparities of wealth and power on our planet, where you have people, who 1/10 of 1/100th of a percent are controlling more resources than half the population, not only in this country, but all around the world. So we have to be aware that there's a much bigger picture that I'm trying to put this phenomena into. Now, some people are going to say, no, that's bogus. This is, a scientific investigation. And well, let's just talk about leave all this woo-woo stuff and let's just talk about nuts and bolts. And I think that limited perspective is not only is it unenlightened, but it's also ridiculous, because those people who promote the nuts and bolts approach are trying to do it as a science. But when you go to MUFON and you talk to the activists in that organization, which is very successful for what they do and provides a service to the larger society in terms of sighting reports. But if you tell them, I'm going out to engage the phenomena directly so that I don't have to listen to other people's sightings reports like you're doing in MUFON, I'm going to write my own sighting report. They get scared. They actually are frightened of the subject because they've been listening to abductionist propaganda for 10, 15, 30 years, that they see contact as being in the context of a criminal act, a so-called alien abduction. Well, what kind of scientist is afraid of his test tube? What kind of scientist is afraid, of his telescope? And the essence of science is real-time investigation. And what MUFON has been doing is important for sure, but it's more like journalism, describing things that happened in the past.
Yeah.
So I went into this CE5 initiative after having 30 years of experience since a teenager as being an organizer in social movements.
And in that, you came across a few prime contactees.
Well, Stephen Greer was the first, and
Right.
he was an outstanding example. Now, there'll be perhaps some people in your audience who have little liking for Stephen Greer. I should say from the beginning that I worked very closely with him. He was a generous host. I spent time at his home. I shared meals with him, and we worked in the contact network that he founded, but that was primarily run by Shari Admak. And that kind of camaraderie of when you're under very intense situations inspires a kind of loyalty. I honor the work that we did together, those 5-6 years that I was active in his network. But when I broke with him for personal, political, and professional reasons in 1998, I have not spoken to him since, but I have followed his continuing activities through talking to people who are working directly with him, as well as over the years watching his videos and reading his books. But I'm no longer a fan of Stephen Greer, MD, and I have, on social media, offered what I hope are fair and balanced criticisms, but nonetheless criticisms of what he's become these last 25 years since we no longer are associated.
Yeah, and so you met some other prime contactees. Do you just want to mention them briefly?
Yeah. First of all, I was limited when I joined the network. I hadn't been meditating. I was an atheist, so it was a leap of faith to get involved in a program. But as part of the process, I developed some rudimentary knowledge of spirituality, started a regular meditation practice, and I noticed there were things that were happening to me that were unusual. I lost my taste for meat. I'd always been a meat and potato man. Kill one cow, kill them all. I wanted meat and potatoes on the table. Once I started meditating and praying, which was also, Stephen Greer recommended a book by Larry Dossey, another physician, Larry Dossey, MD, Recovering the Soul. And he made a very good case for the benefits of non-directive prayer. So I started praying as well. And I became, you might call a new age neo-Buddhist. That was a radical change, but also lost 20 pounds and was hiking in the high desert and was healthier mentally and physically than I had been in, since I started medical school some 20 years before. So Stephen Greer was the real deal during the earlier years. His capacity to attract the phenomena has somewhat decreased, and this happens. It happened to Sixto Wells, who was also another prime contactee, who was one of the most prominent people in the network, known initially as Mission Rama, then became Rama, and now is Rama with a R-A. HMA designation. And they were the Peruvian contactees that started in 1974 in Lima, Peru. And they facilitated thousands of people having what I call HICE, human-initiated contact events, popularly known as CE5. And by the time that when Stephen Greer was still in high school, they were doing similar type work with profound levels of psi interactions. And they developed people who used automatic writing, multiple individuals who they called antennas when they gave good, accurate information. So the idea of CE5, which is, I think, an unfortunate term, I prefer HICE, human-initiated contact event, that was going on, back in the 70s. And what I realized in working with Stephen Greer is that he had an ongoing direct telepathic relationship with the intelligence behind the phenomena. He went out in Gulf Breeze in March of 1992. But even before that, and we'll get into that, a year previously in Asheville, North Carolina, he had a successful CE5 in which, according to his report, it was picked up on local airport radar. And it was after that event, I believe, that he not only attracted the interest of the intelligence community, but they actually facilitated one of their people to make contact with him.
As a result of which one, 91 or 92?
91.
Okay. And that was in North Carolina?
Yep, it was the first. He had for a very short time, he had a working group. Stephen Greer is a marvelous meditator. He's a skilled organizer in the kinds of events that made this Project Starlight, then became the Disclosure Project. But he never really ran a working group, which is a whole different set of skills. But for a while, he did have, people in Asheville, North Carolina that were working with him. But people don't usually stay with Stephen Greer too long. I lasted 5 years with some difficulty. There's a long line of, you might call it the Stephen Greer Broken Hearts Club. There's a long line of talented activists who have been turned off because of some of the unfortunate parts of his persona and behavior.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common theme with Dr. Greer, is that there's a lot of rotating support. So people are supporters for a while, they get close, they learn about some stuff, and then they kind of are turned off and move
I had
beyond.
I had to work very hard to stay in his network. I was ready to break with him in 95. That's a whole difference. That's how I came up with the term HICE. And it was very interesting what happened. I may have mentioned this before. We should perhaps do a whole session on intelligence, counterintelligence, and how the intelligence services worked the contact network in terms of surveillance and that sort of thing. But in any case, another example. We're getting back to Prime Contactee. Another example, so it was the Gulf Breeze sightings, okay? And there on Navarre Beach, 25, 30 miles from Pensacola Naval Air Station, we're heavily monitored by multiple airports, as well as the sophisticated radar of the Naval Air Station. He was able to track not one, but 3 typical Gulf Breeze UFOs. And on the videos that you can still see on the internet, they're the typical Gulf Breeze. There's a bright light, and then there's underneath, there's a power ring. And the people who lived in Gulf Breeze and had been having sightings there, for 3 or 4 years before Stephen Greer showed up and facilitated that March 1992 event. They said, yeah, there was no doubt that those were what they called extraterrestrial spacecraft at the time. So that was, those videos, by the way, are the best and practically only evidence that Stephen Greer was allowed, and his entire contact network was allowed to have, in terms of quality videos of contact events. And when I was in Mexico with Stephen Greer and 3 other contact workers, a massive triangular-shaped UFO came out between the volcanoes. It was several hundred feet across at night. It was signaling at us. It blocked out the stars. It was accompanied by a small, maybe 30 feet disc compared to the larger so-called mothership. But our attempts to document that event was complicated by an event of high strangeness when all our cameras stopped working as soon as the UFO got close. I'm talking about state of the art, which was pretty primitive back then, but we had night vision attached to a video camera. We had the 35mm single lens reflex. We even had a cheap spring operated, one of these brownies, click, or I used to call them brownies. None of the equipment, including the spring operated camera, worked as we were interacting with this large UFO that signaled at us and signaled back at us, that sort of thing. So, you know, Stephen Greer had a track record. One very interesting event that showed, in my mind, clearly he had direct telepathic communication with the intelligences behind the phenomena, was that in the fall of 1995, we had a conference in Asheville, North Carolina, and as part of that training module that was associated with the conference, we went out in the Appalachian Mountains. I think it was near Mount Washington, one of the highest points in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And Stephen Greer told us, as we were assembled around him, the encounter is going to last 45 minutes. And I looked at the clock, and as we were staring up into the sky, which was heavily overcast, directly above us, a circle of clearing occurred in the cloud cover. It was like, if you've ever seen the old-fashioned irises to a camera that could be opened and closed, like fisheye, I think they call it. But in any case, the circle of clarity got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then a UFO appeared, and we had interactions with signaling in the center of that cleared space. 45 minutes later, to the minute, Stephen Greer said it was over, and the clouds came in again from all sides in a very unnatural way, and cleared and provided a cloud cover once again for us to, and that was it. So it's that kind of direct telepathic communication where he was able to get advance notice, and Stephen Greer told the working group coordinators that you too may be given advance notice as to when, where in the sky, and the number of craft that are going to appear. And on 2 separate occasions during my tour as working group coordinator, I did indeed receive advanced, very accurate information. It was October 1993. One craft was going to appear in the northwest sky at exactly 2 a.m. where our team was operating at the base of Queen Mountain. And then several years later, the same thing happened again when we were filming in Topanga State Park, an encounter. I got advance notice that 3 craft were going to appear in the, again, it was northwest sky, but in a different location. This time it was 9 o'clock. And sure enough, the events that occurred were congruent with the advance notice that I had received. Now, by 1993, I was having a crisis, a leadership type of crisis, because I had gone a long way from being I used to call myself diehard materialist. And I had to do a 12-step recovery program to recover my soul. And so I was, but still, I did not have psychic ability. And there was a couple of encounters that occurred where I actually became frightened by the phenomena. And that was discouraging me considerably, because here I was supposed to lead a team. And I was an emergency room physician and dealing with a lot of adversity. And yet I was fearful that beings would come right into our research site, which actually did happen on some occasions. So I needed to get closer to the phenomenon. I was praying for assistance. Well, assistance came to me in the form of a boost in my psychic ability and the manifestation of the second prime contactee that I met, a young man that I'll call Misha. I call him, that's not his real name, but he surfaced, and I use the word surface because in my judgment, rather than a scientific paradigm, one should look at the UFO phenomena from an intelligence counterintelligence perspective, not the perspective of the national security state, but the perspective of a social movement that will exist in the future that will demand world peace, social justice, and environmental protection. So in any case, and I think of the prime contactees in a sense as being agents, and Jacques Vallée used the term higher intelligence agency. And I look at prime contactees as agents, or maybe even case officers, as the case might be, for working for a higher intelligence agency. And so Misha surfaced as an EKG tech in 1992. And, there were a lot of things about him that were attractive. We were both Jewish, both of Eastern European, Russian Jewish descent. And he even came from an area where about a few hundred miles from where my grandparents on my mother's side grew up before they emigrated to the United States. He was from Belarus, which is not far from the Lithuanian and Latvian countries where they were. And I also spoke Russian because I studied in college. So I had a person to talk Russian to. And in 1992, he said something innocuous like, what do you think of UFOs? And at that point, I was not sharing openly in the ER what I was doing. Eventually, I got very open about it. And to the point where the nurses used to tease me and they'd say, Dr. Burkes, are you running out to chase UFOs? And I would kid them back and say, with my best New York accent, you think that the UFOs, you think I'm chasing the UFOs? No, they're chasing me. And before I came out of the closet, as it were, I didn't, respond to when Misha said to me, what do you think of UFOs? I said something like, well, space is so vast that if there weren't intelligent life out there, it would be an incredible waste of space. But as I got more experienced as a working group coordinator in the second year in 1993, he then surfaced and told me a story. Now, I can't verify this story, but it certainly had an impact on the course of my field work for the next 4 years. And that was, he said that when he was an adolescent in Russia, he had a number of sightings. He even claimed that he was taken on board for what sounded like an emergency appendectomy. But that's another story. But in any case, he had an ongoing relationship with UFO intelligences as a contactee. Not surprisingly, it was a happy, positive relationship. And he said that while he was in Belarus, waiting to emigrate to the United States, he had a dream in which allegedly, take it with a big grain of salt, he would emigrate to the United States, would get a job in healthcare because he was trained as a nurse in a military junior college. And he would work with a tall, bearded Jewish doctor. Didn't have glasses at the time. I was more blonde than gray. And he would do contact work with that individual. So a year after he's working in the emergency room, he says to me, when I came to work here a year ago, I saw you. He was working then as an EKG tech. You were the person in my dream. That seemed pretty far-fetched at the time, but considering what happened once he joined the team and our level of contact went up, and practically every time Misha was in the field with us, we would have sightings and other kind of interactions. Go ahead.
And I think this is important to point out. And there's a pattern here too, which you don't have to discuss, but we'll both recognize, right, is that just because somebody has a high level of contact and success with UFO contact or is a prime contactee, that has nothing to say of their moral compass.
Oh, the prime contactees span the full gambit of good, bad, and ugly. It's just
I just want to point that.
Yeah, it's an important point because in New Age subculture, there's the mixing of spiritual development with UFO contact, and people somehow imagine that we're being rewarded by our high level of spiritual. And this is another reason why the counterintelligence intelligence model comes in. And UFO intelligences, because they're operating in hostile territory, not only attempts to shoot them down, but also to persecute and silence witnesses who they are working with, they have to adopt the position of a kind of higher intelligence agency that might at times appear somewhat ruthless in their methods by using as their agents of influence people who have no moral standing whatsoever. But if you're a case officer for an intelligence service, the most important characteristic of someone you're going to work with is, will they get the job done?
Right. And even to the idea really quick, I don't want to sidetrack too much, but you know, there's a constant theme even in spirituality. Although somebody might have high level attainments of wisdom and spiritual knowledge, also in Buddhism, it's recognized that morality is a separate training from wisdom training. And they don't necessarily correlate. So even though somebody might be able to be a master meditator and get into very deep states of wisdom and insight, or even the powers and psychic abilities and what have you, that doesn't mean that they have a great morality compass.
Right.
So again, just something I wanted to point out for people. Just because somebody has a high level of contact does not mean anything else other than that.
Right. I think that's a very important point. And when it came to Misha, I learned the hard way about his failings in the exact way that you described it. But that's another story.
And again, it is another story, but I did want to mention, you know, Dr. Greer had his issues, Misha, and even they were falling out with Sixto Paz Wells and Rama.
Absolutely.
And
a lot of it has
you
to
know,
do with money. And let's be realistic. You know, if you're a president of the United States or a head of a corporation and you want to develop an intelligence network, you don't have to worry about money. Because, you know, corporate security and government security is paid for either by the taxpayers or by the shareholders, okay? But if you're in non-human intelligence trying to establish a network of activists that are going to interact with them over a long-term program that involves, in my judgment, not only a spiritual transformation of our culture, but also allowing us to create the conditions on Earth where we can have open and direct relationships with advanced cultures. That means radical reform of our civilization. Well, if you're trying to develop a network in hostile territory, you're going to have to use some of the methods of an intelligence service operating in just such a situation. And that's why I learned to accept my own failings, but also the failings of other people who are called upon to do this work, because in the long run, the goal is important. We are only taking small steps towards that creation of a better society, in my opinion, is being facilitated by our interactions with the UFO intelligences. Anyway, but
right.
People may not be interested in that, so let's move on.
Yeah, and again, these are all important points. So there are a ton of things I want to talk to you about today. So we covered the prime contactees a little bit. You know, and any other future one, we can go deeper into it. But I did want to talk about, you know, in the result of some of Dr. Greer's early successes with facilitating contact events, human-initiated contact events. He got there was interest in Dr. Greer from the intelligence services and community, and you know, that led to people interacting with Dr. Stephen Greer, and he was even invited to a conference, the TREAT conference.
We have to back up a little bit, and
Okay.
I'm going to recommend a book to the audience. Every contact and disclosure contact worker, volunteer worker, should read Managing Magic by Grant Cameron. If you cannot read that book, then get a hold of his Portal to Ascension webinar on the same topic from 2017. Because what happened to Stephen Greer happened before. He was approached by the intelligence services very early in his career as a contact activist. but it happened before. And what Grant has put forward is that the US government, the executive branch, the intelligence services, and with some interaction from the corporate aerospace industry, they have a gradual acclimatization program. That on one hand, you have a UFO cover, which is truly massive in nature, and you have what has been called the UFO truth embargo, but it's a leaky cover-up. It's a leaky embargo. In other words, for reasons that will become clear, I hope, in a moment, it's important that the terrestrial population, the American people in particular, have some awareness of the reality of the phenomena. And this is done because the intelligence services and the major corporations that are responsible for the cover-up, I call them the control groups, which is a far preferable term to the term cabal, which you may have heard, which my Jewish friends complain is anti-Semitic, and hopefully people will stop using that term to describe those control groups that are managing the cover-up. But in any case, they have been carrying out from the very beginning, I'm talking about the control groups, the executive branch intelligence services, a program of, on one hand, you have a massive cover-up. On the other hand, you have leaking of a combination of accurate information and some disinformation. And so in Managing Magic, Grant Cameron, in a masterful analysis, has talked about messiahs. It's a somewhat pejorative term and somewhat sarcastic, but these are people who play an important role in terms of the government's gradual acclimatization program. So you had the most prominent being Bill Moore in the 1980s, who was openly, in the end, exposed as someone who was working with the intelligence services. Then you had Dr. Stephen Greer in the 90s, and now more recently you have Tom DeLonge. All of them follow a similar MO, where in order to disguise the government's fingerprints on the release of information, they work through intermediaries. And in terms of Bill Moore, it was the MJ-12 documents, which some of our viewers may not recall, but was briefing papers allegedly prepared for General Eisenhower when he became president of the United States. And it talked about this group of specially empowered, very prominent scientists and government agents and politicians who were controlling the investigation of the phenomena, as well as the cover-up, the so-called MJ-12. And then you've got Dr. Stephen Greer, who from the very beginning was set up not by the executive branch, but by the intelligence behind the phenomena itself to play that role. He was groomed not only by the US intelligence services, but by the higher intelligence agency, so-called boys upstairs. That's the way Stephen Greer, Grant Cameron calls them.
Yeah, UFO intelligence.
And they did this in a spectacular event that had related to the Bush White House. I'm talking about Bush Daddy, the first Bush president we had in the 1980s. And it was a drug summit that was supposed to occur. And Dr. Greer has written about this in his book. I believe, despite his detractors saying that he makes things up, I believe he accurately described in the book, as well as the stories he told with us, how in 1988, and when he was in Washington, D.C. with his family on a trip, he had a remote view of an attempt of an assassination on the president of the United States, who was flying in Air Force One into Colombia, and the drug lords who had obtained from the Fedayeen, the Afghan freedom fighters, they had obtained Stinger missiles. And in advance of this event, Stephen Greer had a very accurate remote view of a launching of a missile and Air Force One being destroyed. And as Stephen Greer tells the story, and again, some people are going to just throw it away because of the source, but I think he told the truth as he knew it. He was terribly disturbed by this prognostic remote view. Against his wife's wishes, he calls the White House and asks to speak to head of security. And I believe he's written about this in
Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, I think.
Exactly. So you can read up on that event. But in any case, detailed information was transmitted from the CSETI director to be. That was 2 years before CSETI was founded in 1990. And he was even able to identify the insignias on the uniforms of the units of the Colombian Defense Forces that had been infiltrated and were launching this missile. So then there was a change in the security arrangements for Bush, and he landed in a separate place, and it was US Marines who were in charge of security, and there was a controversy about that as well. So when people asked why he got that remote view, I believe it was Stephen Greer who volunteered the information that, and certainly it seems obvious to me, that that remote view was given to him by the so-called UFO intelligences to introduce himself, to give his calling card, and through him, their calling card to the executive branch of the United States government. So in 1990, Stephen Greer, if you've one of his followers or read his book, you know that he actually, when he was 18 years old, he had what he believed was his first onboard experience as a teenager. And then some 15 years later, he gets a very strong telepathic message, to, according to Greer again, to pick up the work that he had put down. And he had developed the technique of coherent thought sequencing as a teenager, where deep meditation would allow him to facilitate the attraction of UFOs. And he had numerous sightings as a teenager. What happened was he didn't share this in public, and he only shared it with a few of his closest confidants, which for a couple of years I was. Then we had a falling out in 97. But I don't think I've ever shared this story. I don't think he would deny it, because in the CSETI circles, this was a common knowledge what Stephen Greer had shared. In 1990, he had another onboard experience. This time, they allegedly landed in his backyard. And if you've ever been to the old house that Stephen Greer remodeled, it was a palatial estate. He and his wife were involved in getting old mansions from the Biltmore Manor, fixing them up and selling them, so that he was able to accumulate a small fortune, along with the money that he earned working 50, 60 hours a week in the ER. So he was financially independent when he started his career of contact activism. And on the second onboard experience, he said that he went to a satellite. He assumed it was the moon because, and he was able to go to the place on the lunar surface. This is allegedly in ET spacecraft. I know this sounds kind of crazy, but this is the story, and I don't think he was lying. And from what he shared with us on his conversations from the intelligence services, I don't think they thought he was lying either. And he was able to see at the dividing line between the dark and light side of the moon, massive UFOs above the lunar surface, and purple lightning bolts were going up and down in a kind of electric charging. And he, at the level of knowledge, he acquired the information that these were massive UFOs that were going to be involved with facilitating a contact program that was going to unfold in the 1990s, the next decade. Okay, so I believe that story may be in Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge. I'm not sure, but in any case, it's important to take note of, because he later then described what he had seen to some people in the intelligence community, and allegedly they confirmed that they had imaging that showed that such structures existed. But in any case, 1991, 1990, he formed CSETI after the second alleged onboard experience. And then he went on to have a successful CE5, and I think it was the spring of 91, where in Asheville, North Carolina, they were able to track the UFO. And he said it was picked up on the radar of the local airfield. Sometime around that time, Stephen Greer told us that a Commander Will Miller, in full uniform, he was then an active duty commanding, he was a commander in the Naval Intelligence. He comes to his house, again, I'm not sure Will Miller will confirm this because of the sensitive nature of the conversation that was shared to us. All the working group coordinators, unfortunately, I'm the only one left, heard this story. His closest supporter, Stephen Greer. And allegedly, Will Miller says to Stephen Greer, I want to help you. There are people in Washington that want to help you. And allegedly, this in uniform, this commander said, I believe that you have been put on Earth by God to open up our civilization to contact with extraterrestrials. Now, if you know anything about Grant Cameron's Managing Magic scenario, where the recruiters of intelligence services play to people's weaknesses, and Grant has said that all messiahs, whether it be Bill Moore, Dr. Stephen Greer, or Tom DeLonge, they all have big egos. And so this plea of flattery and cooperation is one of their tools to bring you in to their orbit. I mean, they're intelligence officers, so they have great people skills. They have charm, they go to charm school. I have to tell you that if you've ever been with a case officer, typically in the intelligence service, these are nice guys. I spent 2 days with Richard Doty at a conference in 2019, and I had a good. I mean, I enjoyed his company. It was fun to be with him, even though people despise him for all the terrible things that they imagine he's done, most of which is not true. But none in the case. So Will Miller is also a very charming guy. And if you want to hear that charm, you should listen to the 2013 interview between Stephen Greer and Will Miller on the Pooja network that they recorded. I think that's one of the few times they were on together. And it was there that he admitted Stephen Greer couldn't remember the exact year that they met. Will Miller reminded it was 1991.
Yeah.
So Stephen Greer was already on their radar from '88, and then with his successful CE5 in '91, Miller shows up, and then in '92, he goes on to have a series of incredible encounters. The one I mentioned was Gulf Breeze. And what happened? Well, 1 month later, he's appearing at Treat. Now, for those viewers who may not remember what seems like ancient UFO history, Treat was an organization that was primarily investigating experiencers, although they put it totally within the paradigm of abductions. And Treat stands TREAT, Treatment and Research for Experienced Anomalous Trauma, TREAT. General Stubblevine, who was head of US Army intelligence, he was then retired. You can learn about him more from books on remote viewers, as well as I think Ingo Swann and others. In any case, this retired US, and this guy's really tough. You know, you'd be Army intelligence. You got to be a tough person. And his wife, Renee LeBeau, I think, psychiatrist, was one of the facilitators. And all of a sudden, an organization that investigates alien abductions is inviting what you might call a raging contactee, Stephen Greer, to be the keynote speaker at their conference, which would seem like somewhat of an anomaly. He's saying, ET good, we have to make nice and interact. They're viewing the contact experience within the confines of what they define as a criminal act, abductions. Nevertheless, you know, politics makes strange bedfellows, fellows. UFO politics even stranger. Okay, strange. Okay, so again, this is information that was communicated not just to me, but to all the working group coordinators and Dr. Greer's closest supporters. I don't believe this has ever been written down. Maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. In any case, Stephen Greer is well received. After that, there was a reception in the general's suite at the hotel where the meeting was being held. According to Stephen Greer, who's 6'3", and in those days was in tremendous physical condition as a bodybuilder and, marathon. Well, he didn't do marathons, but he rode his bike 20, 30, 50 miles and was in great physical shape. And you have these very tough people. Stolbein was there. Ed Dames was there. I don't know if David Blackmore was there. He wrote a book on remote viewing. He was in that circle. He was a major, retired. These are all retired officers. And I think John Alexander may have also been there as well. I seem to recall that name came up as well. So according to Stephen Greer, you can take it with a grain of salt, or in my case, I believe he told it accurately because I heard him tell this story a dozen times to different close members, inner circle of CSETI. And the story always was exactly the same. And as Mark Twain liked to remark, the nice thing about telling the truth is you only have to remember it one way. If this was a tall tale, there would be discrepancies. And yet every time I heard him describe these events, exactly as he said it happened. So in this conference suite, allegedly, this tough intelligence officer, retired, a general, says, "Who gives you the right to do this work?" And Stephen Greer was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "Who gives you, Stephen Greer, the right to do this work?" In other words, there was an element of threat or confrontation. And according to the CSETI director, Stephen Greer said, "Well, my people have been here in terms of the settlers going back to the 17th and 18th century. And I think one of his grandparents was either quarter or half Cherokee. So Stephen Greer traced his lineage back even further through his native connection. And he said, and furthermore, my uncle was one of the researchers, scientists, engineers who worked on the lunar module. He had played a critical role. So I'm a patriotic American. My family's been involved with space, and I don't need anybody's permission to do this. This is my right. I don't know if he quoted the Constitution. I have freedom of association. When I've been confronted, who gives you the right to do this? Well, as a free citizen of the United States, freedom of association. And so, according to the CSETI director, Stolbein looked him hard and said, "Okay, just hold this." And one of the people who was functioning like an adjutant for the general, retired, left the room. And they talked about other things. 45 minutes later, the adjutant comes back, takes the general aside, says something to him. And then Stubblebine comes back and he says, "Okay." And Greer says, "Okay, what?" "Okay, you can do it. You have our permission." And so what Stubblebine was describing was a group of operatives within the control. The term he used back then was better than cabal. He called the control groups. And that, I think, is a more accurate description of the way in which a UFO cover-up can be managed. You have a bunch of different factions or cells operating in coordination, sometimes in opposition, but basically, Stephen Greer was given permission by the control groups to do this. And that's when the charm offensive allegedly started. Stephen Greer alleged that he was given money. There was some conflation of I think it was 7 or 8 figures. About $5 to $10 million was what he could set up his own institute. He'd never have to worry about money again. But all the research would be kept by the sponsoring organization, kind of like what Bigelow set up. A lot of their findings was secret, okay? And this was not what his friends in the higher intelligence agency had commissioned him to do. A network of working groups who would use PSI to interact as part of an opening up of our civilization to contact with advanced cultures. So Stephen Greer said no, and the phone calls kept coming. And I remember he even described how his wife was told by Stubblebine how brilliant Stephen was and how smart and handsome, whatever, charm school offensive.
Yeah.
And Emily allegedly said, why don't you, listen to what he has to say? Finally, when Stephen Greer says, hell no, there was hell to pay. House was broken into, even though they have a private security for their whole area. Nothing was taken, but his file would be left open, which he usually locked. It's that sort of thing. So nonetheless, he proceeded with his organizing efforts at tremendous personal cost. In the old days, we paid $40 to join CSETI and $40 for a workshop. And I can tell you from 1992 to 1994, almost every time, 95% of the time, if you went out with Stephen Greer, you were guaranteed a sighting. I saw it. I went out in the field with him maybe 5-10 times, and 9 out of 10, there was, anomalous activity in the sky, and also things happening around you on the ground too. Then comes phase 2. If you read Managing Magic, again, or watch the video, Portals to Ascension, Grant Cameron describes how John Peterson, who's a personal friend of then CIA director, the first under the Clinton administration, James Woolsey, who had an interesting Navy connection. A lot of these guys, Edgar Mitchell had a Navy connection. He was a Navy aviator. You got Commander Will Miller. You got the Wilson tapes, again, an admiral, head of DIA, but Navy intelligence. So there's a big Navy connection. And Woolsey, although he was a lawyer during his military service, I think he was Undersecretary of the Navy for a while. I think that was. So there's all these guys have Navy connections. And there was John Peterson, who's head of the Arlington Institute, which is a small but very successful think tank for the defense industry. He was a former Navy aviator. And I got to meet John Peterson when the Charm School offensive second wave was in process. And it was John Peterson who set up a meeting with his friend, CIA Director Woolsey. And I happened to be at the CSETI planning meetings where there was a discussion of how the CIA director was going to meet with Stephen Greer. And I think I even saw the telegram where John Peterson described the special security arrangements. They had to have a cover story. It was going to be a dinner party, yada, yada, yada. Peterson and Woolsey then later denied that there was a briefing, but really the controversy had to do with the meaning of the word briefing. In Washington, a briefing is where an intelligence officer with a briefcase handcuffed to his arm brings in papers, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then you're read into the program. So they were denied that there was a briefing, but there was a meeting. It was later acknowledged. And as Grant Cameron says, anytime a UFO investigator meets with the head of CIA and talks about UFOs, it's a big deal. Okay, yeah. But it's not happened. So that was the next phase of Stephen Greer's involvement. And it's best to think of him as an agent of influence at times, but at times far more than just an agent of influence, because unlike Bill Moore in the 1980s and rock star and owner of To the Stars Academy,
Tom
DeLonge in the current time, Stephen Greer was an agent of UFO intelligence with direct telepathic communication with that intelligence. So, when you ask people in the intelligence community, why do you follow contact experience around? Why do you carry out surveillance of high-level contactees? The answer you get back is that the intelligence doesn't like, the UFO intelligence doesn't like their counterparts in the national security state. And so they have to follow the contactees in order to learn something. And so that's why there's great interest with Christopher Bledsoe, Stephen Greer, and why there was considerable interest in our operations as well. But that, again, is another story where we can talk about all the surveillance and the threatening phone calls and all the other stuff that we had to endure during those years. So in any case, this gives you a background to my early years of participation, where I was witness to how Grant Cameron's described gradual acclimatization program was carried out with Stephen Greer as an agent of influence for the groups within the intelligence services that are working for more openness on this subject and the intelligence behind the phenomenon.
Yeah, and it's no secret that Dr. Stephen Greer received a lot of help and support from people within the intelligence community, those who we've named here and other people with deep connections who we haven't named, who helped Dr. Stephen Greer in different ways in this, again, acclimatization, managing magic kind of idea. But I did also want to discuss the Wilson meeting that happened in 1997, which people are going to be familiar with nowadays through the Wilson-Davis notes, where Eric Davis met with Wilson in 2002 by the EG&G building in a car and had a discussion about Wilson's journey trying to discover these kind of secret UFO programs that are unacknowledged special access programs. But this story goes back and it begins in 1997 with Dr. Stephen Greer, Edgar Mitchell, Commander Will Miller, and Thomas Wilson in the Pentagon. But I was actually, I found a letter actually between Will Miller and Tom Wilson from 1995. So, Admiral or Vice Admiral Tom Wilson, Deputy Director of the DIA, was having conversations with Will Miller about this subject in 95 in preparation 2 years before they actually met in the Pentagon in 97.
Right. And you have to acknowledge a certain sociological or political fact of life. And that is, this is the Super Bowl. That's the term that Grant Cameron uses. Each one of us is in the Super Bowl. And it's the biggest game in the history of our planet, how these advanced cultures are reaching out and interacting with our civilization. And they have been doing it for a very long time. And then you've got the United States military. These are officers who have been trained, made sacrifices for their country. Some of them even died. And nonetheless, they are denied access to one of the most important military industrial intelligence challenges that the national security state and all governments in the world face. Because the secrecy of this project, and remember Grant Cameron from the notes that he got from Wilbur Smith back in 1950, the UFO investigation was held at a level of classification, according to Wilbur Smith, who interacted with American officials in Washington, D.C. in 1950, the level of classification was higher than that for the H-bomb, the development of the super, as they called it. So you can have a corporal or a sergeant like Richard Doty, who's read into these programs and is allowed to interact with these projects and carry out intelligence work. But the general, his officers up the chain of command, may not have access. For people who have dedicated their lives to serving their country, to be denied participation is potentially highly humiliating. And this is exactly what happened. So you can go on with the narrative. And I was there at the behind closed door briefings in April of 1997 when Edgar Mitchell, Commander Will Miller, Stephen Greer, and Sherry Adamak were into the Pentagon. I know that the meeting happened because I saw them making arrangements for transportation and everything else to get over there. So that and I believe Stephen Greer's description of that description and analysis of that meeting and those events was accurate. He was attacked continuously when he started talking about it. And yet the evidence shows that not only was Admiral Wilson denied access to those reverse engineering projects, but he apparently, according to the notes that then young scientist had when he interviewed him, was also threatened with loss of retirement benefits, and one of the stars would be taken off his admiralty status. So that brings you to 1997, and that was a year later. I resigned from CSETI again for political, personal, and professional reasons.
Yeah. I also, I just wanted to brush up on that really quickly since we're talking about some of the meetings that Stephen Greer had. But, you mentioned that you had resigned from CSETI, and, is there any detail that you want to go into about why you
Yeah,
resigned?
I can talk about it because there is, I won't talk about the personal and the professional because that's, I think, somewhat indelicate. It would reveal certain confidences even to this date that I'm willing to keep, even though I don't have anything to do with Stephen Greer for 25 years. But on the political, it had to do with the nature of the CE5 initiative. Now, in 1992, 93, and 94, we were doing very well. We had working groups coming into operation. I was empowered to train. So was Sherry. So was Wayne. And we had satellite groups, and we had, a half dozen groups that were coming in and out. But there was only 3 groups: Phoenix with Wayne, Sherry, and in Denver, and I was in LA. And my team was set up almost. I could never have organized that team by myself. UFO Intelligence provided me not with 1, but with 2 other physicians in my medical group. They facilitated contact and staged sightings for my colleagues to draw them into my team. We had 2 PhD psychologists, one with 30 years experience. We had a 747 pilot who was also recruited, who showed up. And we had a writer in Hollywood who seemingly by chance showed up at the same conference that I did and saw Stephen Greer in 1992. So you had behind the scenes a lot of support to bring the working groups together through synchronicity. I could write a chapter on that alone.
Oh, I'm sure.
In any case, 94, but then as Starlight, which was the precursor for the
Disclosure Project.
Disclosure Project, took up more and more time of Stephen Greer's, he's working, 40, 50 hours a week. He's got 4 daughters at home, and he's creating this project to bring witnesses forward. He stopped doing as many trainings, and we were not getting the kind of support from Asheville that some of the people on my team, I know Joe Vallejo said, the 747 pilot said, Stephen Greer's dropped us. But we were working with Sherry, who was the real heart and soul of the CE5 initiative at that point. But in any case, and she gave us a lot of good advice, right? Even though I disagreed with her and we had fights, when it came to running a working group, she basically taught me a lot of what I needed to know to be successful. And so things are going along, and I'm now got this prime contactee with me, Misha, where every time we go out into the field, we're having some very intense experiences. I mentioned in previous lectures that there was a series of missing time events that went right across the CE5 network. And one after another, people in Denver, then Phoenix, then myself and Misha, we had missing time, sometimes in the course of field work. We had double missing time where we'd lose continuity of consciousness, and then we'd awaken and then lose it again. This happened, double missing time. So as if the intelligence was working the entire network to send us a message. Yes, they can do this. They were demonstrating their psych capabilities to the experiencers who were reaching out to them. But as time went on, everything became Project Starlight. And I wanted to, the internet was young in those days, and I wanted to publish our reports on the internet. And I was using the moniker LAC SETI. Well, this, for some reason, didn't sit well with Stephen Greer, who made it clear there was only one CSETI. It was based in Asheville, North Carolina. And I was no longer free to release my reports on the internet. And I said, wait a second. The only way we're going to be able to get this job done is to have a network of working groups, as many as possible. And by sharing our findings, successes and failures, whatever, we can use the internet as a teaching vehicle and build the network. No. That didn't sit well with Stephen Greer. And Sherry Adamek, who was given the unpleasant work of being, she was described as Stephen Greer's hatchet lady. She just basically said, you can send your reports to CSETI Central, but you're no longer allowed to issue the reports on the internet. And this infuriated me because I was recruited to do exactly what I described, help build the network. And I now had working with me a little Stephen Greer, a prime contactee who could track the phenomena. And we could be far more successful if we were able to share our findings. So at that point, I made a break. I said, okay, we're going to break with CSETI, CE5 initiative. And I came up with the term HICE, Human Initiated Contact Experience. Later it changed to event. And we're going to build our own network. And one of my colleagues who was active in the team, Dave Gordon, family practitioner, who said to me, well, what's the difference between HICE and CE5? I said, HICE is the CE5 initiative without Stephen Greer. We're going to do it on our own. But we didn't announce anything. We just called people. I lined up activists. All our communications were on the internet. And I basically was prepared to make a break. However, something happened which held me back. Somebody with a very heavy British accent calls Misha's house. I don't know where she got his number. In the middle of the night, when he's working as a nurse at the hospital, my prime contactee, Misha, and says she wants to help. So she calls when Misha's available and they have a discussion. And she says, we really want to help you with HICE. And Misha, I should say, gets very excited about it and says, Joe, you see, we're getting success. People want to help us, And I said, what's wrong with this picture, Misha? He says, what? I says, did you bring up the term HICE or did she? He says, she brought it up. So where did she get that information? She's an unknown entity. We don't know. All our communications are telephone, and so we're being set up. They want to, quote, help us in order to divide the CE5 initiative, and hopefully we'll fight among ourselves and our contact efforts will go nowhere, because building unity and cooperation within the team and within the network is a key to building cooperation with the intelligence behind the phenomena. So at that point, I said, let's cancel our plans. I then went back to CSETI Central and I said to Sherry, listen, if you insist on denying us access to the internet to give our reports out, when we make major breakthroughs, because I was very open that I had Misha working with me, we are not going to give credit to the parent organization for our successes. And that's when a light went on. I assume in Stephen Greer's head, he said, no, that's not that. I don't like that idea so much, because we'd be taking away from him and his importance. So we worked out a negotiation. I could issue my reports with a proviso saying the opinions and information provided are of the author alone, Joe Burkes. They do not reflect policy or programs of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And then I put that proviso on my documents, and I continued organizing. And I was able to do that because I had developed sufficient confidence in my organizing ability that I didn't need Stephen Greer. I need less and less of Sherry's assistance. And I had my, my prime contactee who was going to facilitate those interactions.
Yeah. And again, that was in the late 90s.
1995.
Oh, no. That you actually resigned.
I resigned in 98, but then things got really messy but that's a whole nother story. But there was a problem. I was a problem. See, I have a background that's, I've been active in peace and justice movements for many years. But through my associations, I also was involved with people who were on the far left and were under surveillance by the federal government for reasons you can understand. So the fact that Stephen Greer is going to be developing a more intimate relationship with the executive branch intelligence services, and you can read that as NSA, CIA, whatever. I was a potential thorn because I was not politically reliable. I was too in opposition to the operations of the intelligence community because I had been active in support for Vietnam to stop the war. I was active in movements during the 80s in support of Marxist regimes in Nicaragua that was run by priests, by the way. They were Marxist priests. And also supporting activists who wanted to have end to US intervention in Latin America. So I kind of was, so I received a series of threatening phone calls, which is a whole nother story. At first I thought it was carried out by Stephen Greer's opponents, who wanted to deny a real, at that point I was a crackerjack organizer. I was able to give lectures, I raised money for the organization and gave a lot of support. So I thought it was the opposition that was trying to scare me off. Now I think it was probably, his friends in the executive branch intelligence services. So they made certain threats. I was in my late 40s. I had 2 kids who I thought I would like to live long enough to support going through college, and I, basically combination of some personal stuff that happened with Stephen Greer, very ugly stuff that happened. I've just resigned. I had it. I described the political reasons, but I won't get into the personal stuff.
Yeah, and actually, in around 2012, 2013, when the Sirius film released, the entire CSETI board of directors resigned at the same time.
Right. See, there's a growing list of the Stephen Greer Lonely Hearts Club. Yeah.
Do you know why the board of directors all resigned at the same time?
I do.
And
just one more point about what happened in '97. The irony is, of course, is that the kind of organizing approach that I was promoting and was being censured for was exactly what happened, because in the interval, although Stephen Greer went from charging $40 to over $1,000 for his workshops and things like that, because he had stopped working as a doctor, so he couldn't support his family without charging what was considered exorbitant fees. But by doing all that year after year after year of organizing, and as well as eventually putting out an app, which people could get for peanuts of $5, $10, that network that I had envisioned came about. So the plan that I was pursuing was manifested, even though one of the principal organizers was discouraged from continuing participation in that in 1987. So I feel gratified that what I wanted came to fruition. So now you've got dozens of people in every country, England, Australia. There's a lot of people carrying out what is called CE5, or staging human initiated contact events. So that I'm happy about that. And now what happened in 2012 was a whole new crew of people that came in, after I was gone, and Costa Macris and Jan Bravo, and they were very close to Stephen Greer. There was a kind of cult-like atmosphere in the group, which I found unhealthy. I remember in 2006? I think it was 2006, I attended a workshop in IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, that Stephen Greer was doing, a one-day workshop. And he was surrounded by a group of close supporters, and Costa was there, and Jan Bravo, another ER physician. But when I introduced myself, as someone who had worked during the early days, they all looked at me with suspicion. It was because, they were suspicious. What happened between you and Greer that you no longer were part of the inner circle? It had a kind of cult dynamic. And there was all kinds of weirdness going on where, Stephen Greer was drawing attention to radar detectors that were supposedly sending signals, but it turns out it was most likely microwaves from cell phones. And he was describing things up in the sky that almost everyone in the audience couldn't see. Some people might have been seeing something, who knows? But there was just a lot of very strange stuff going on. But eventually, they developed the first film, Sirius, right? And there were two producers who were owed something about $80,000 or $100,000. They had completed the film. And in the film, there were segments that showed Stephen Greer doing most of the talking, but Jan Bravo appeared and Costa. There was multiple voices. In other words, to communicate that it's not just Stephen Greer's show, but that there's a network with other people. But according to Costa and others who I talked to, Stephen Greer didn't like the other voices being and also on camera. He wanted them cut, and he was holding back the concluding money that was to go to the producers until they re-edited the film, where all the other people were cut out. So they thought that was pretty backhanded, because he had made promises, and now as board of directors, they still had control of the banking account for the project. And so they wrote a check for the money that was owed, rather than having the producers have to sue Stephen Greer or do what they said. And they resigned en masse. There was, and I tried to get Jan Bravo to corroborate, but apparently a series of intimidations occurred against her, and she's refused to talk to me and only talks to a small circle of friends. But she gave tens of thousands of dollars to the CSETI director.
Yeah, and there's a similar story with the Disclosure Project that other people were cut out of that on the front end, and it looked like Stephen had done the whole thing when other people helped in a lot and didn't get their due credit.
Yeah, I was glad that I didn't have to face that. I had it was a relief to leave Stephen Greer's orbit, because nobody can stay there too long. And
Yeah.
I stuck it out for 5 years by essentially working in parallel to him, but having, in the end, it was personally insulting the way he behaved to me and others. I just had it. I felt sorry for him. I still do, because he's made historic contributions, and he never fulfilled the potential that I had imagined. But I probably had aspirations of something that was far beyond not organizing project that anyone could accomplish. To create a social movement is going to take a long time, and there has to be an accumulation of activists as well as objective conditions, which we are now seeing in terms of the worsening crisis in our environment. Those UFOs are not flying on fossil fuels, and if we could develop a more Pacific Earth civilization, it might be safe to download into our technological culture the secrets of the so-called free energy. But I don't think they're going to let it happen, because they, meaning the ones who control the technology, the so-called ETs, because given our low level of spiritual development, the first application of such mighty power would be for weapons, more efficient ways of killing millions of each other. So, yeah,
and that getting back to Stephen Greer, it's a shame, because again, like you said, he's had historical contributions. We may not be where we are now, if it wasn't for those early days. Again, whether some of the acclimatizations facilitated by the executive branch or whoever are involved in UFO programs, and or obviously the phenomenon working in different ways to influence how disclosure could occur?
Well, this is a project that we're going to be working on for a long time. I mean, I'm not going to, I feel gratified that I've seen one small part of it. I think future generations will look back and think how exciting it must have been during the early days of the contact network. But in order to get to a saner Earth civilization, a great deal of blood, sweat, and tears are going to have to be shed. And I've at least no blood, but plenty of sweat and tears.
Yeah. We definitely have a long road ahead. There is some progress being made now. And, again, that's going to be reliant on how we react to it and what we do with that. So I'm optimistic. But I think that's pretty good for today. I'm going to have you back on because, again, we can do an entire series with you, Dr. Burkes. I really appreciate you coming on here. And we'll have you on again sometime soon.
Thanks so much for letting me share.
Absolutely. Take care.